Hello, everyone. This is Pete Enco, partner in Husch Blackwell's healthcare group. And with me today is my colleague, James Rodenberg. We're excited to give today's presentation on legal strategies for accommodating high-cost drug therapies in plan designs. But before we begin, however, I need to cover a few housekeeping items as is usual. And those are the following. At the bottom of your audience console are multiple application icons for your use during the program today. If you have any questions during the webcast, please submit your question via the question box. We'll try to answer all questions during today's webcast, but if a fuller answer is needed or we run out of time, honestly, as is likely, it'll be answered later via email. We truly appreciate audience participation and encourage you to submit all of your questions. Now, if you have any technical difficulty, please click on the Help icon. It has a question mark and provides information regarding common technical issues. A copy of today's slide deck is available in the Resource List icon that looks like a folder, and it's at the bottom of your screen. Now, this program has been approved for Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Tennessee, and Texas continuing legal education. Colorado and Wisconsin credit is still pending. To report your hours in Illinois, Nebraska, Tennessee, or Texas, click on the CLE widget at the bottom of your screen and complete the questions. A recording of this webcast will be available tomorrow for watching and for sharing. Once available, a link to the recording will be emailed to you along with a certificate of attendance. So, as I mentioned already, joining me today is James Rodenberg. James joined the firm about a year ago and has more than 2 decades of experience and relationship building as general counsel for pharmaceutical companies, most recently Teva Neuroscience. He has handled all aspects of legal work and counseling for business units responsible for the development, launch, sales, marketing, and medical education activities for pharmaceutical products. So with those technical issues out of the way, I can wrap up our webinar-related administrative tasks by offering you a reminder that the content of today's presentation is for general educational purposes only. It is not legal advice. I should also mention that we are coming at today's discussion from the perspective of payers, plans, and plan sponsors. We're wrestling with decisions regarding whether and how to accommodate life-saving biologics and other high-cost medications when developing clinical coverage guidelines and formularies. Now, due to our time constraints, we only have an hour with you, and I've already burned nearly 5 minutes. We won't be taking up the viewpoints of plan members, providers, or pharmaceutical manufacturers, with a few exceptions that we'll get to near the end of our presentation. That said, even if your organization is not a payer, it's not a plan, it's not a plan sponsor, we're hoping that you still find the discussion and our conversation and the policies and the industry developments that we cover somewhat thought-provoking. Okay, that is it for disclaimers. Now let's talk agenda. Today's webinar will begin with the discussion of the clinical, economic, and policy issues associated with coverage determinations related to recently approved high-dollar therapies. We'll then begin to briefly discuss statutory, regulatory, and contractual requirements which influence the development of clinical coverage guidelines and formularies. And then we're also going to walk through a case study related to a recently approved and headline-grabbing gene therapy, as I'm sure you're aware, called Zoll. After that, we're going to describe a few options to enhance access to these high-cost drugs and also address how plan members might accommodate these life-altering treatments when those life-altering treatments may have been excluded from their particular plan design. And then finally, we're going to close with a review of strategies for balancing access and cost challenges that these high-dollar medications bring. So that does it for me for the time being. I'm now going to turn the mic over to James to discuss the challenges to payers and plans and some of those legal and regulatory landscape impacting the development of clinical coverage guidelines and formularies. So James, do you want to take it away?
Yes, thanks, Pete. Also, we'd like to thank everyone who are taking the time to join us today for this webinar. But our goal for today is to provide you with a very high-level overview of the legal framework for developing your clinical coverage guidelines and formularies. But in some situations, that's not enough. So as Pete mentioned, we're going to be talking about some practical considerations that you would keep in mind. So we'll do the legal and the practical. And to help with the practical, as Pete also mentioned, we will be discussing some lessons we learned from assisting one of our clients this past summer, who was faced with the approval of Zoll, which came with a very high price tag. So that'll help us maybe apply some of the things that we're going to be talking about. But I thought just to level set for everyone, first of all, I would point out that clinical coverage guidelines and formularies are closely aligned. And since we'll be talking about what we'll call CCGs and formularies throughout the presentation, I thought I would just give sort of an extremely brief definition of each. So as we're all used to formularies because we are users of pharmacy insurance benefits, a formulary is a listing of drugs that the plan's approved for coverage, and usually at what tier that they'll do the cost sharing for the member, okay? So it's a list of drugs. On the other hand, a clinical coverage guideline, or a CCG, is a plans document that outlines the guidelines the plan publishes and sets out information about the treatment, or in this case, you know, that we're going to be talking about today, the drug, to help provide providers guidance in their decision making. And for drugs, it'll approve information about the approved labeling, any requirements for any prior authorizations, or things like step edits or other coverage information. But it's important to note, just because a drug's approved and prescribed, not all drugs are on a formulary, or not all drugs will necessarily have a clinical coverage guideline.
So James, just interject real quick. You know, thanks for laying out the theme for today's webinar. But before we get too much further, can you go ahead and detail some of the policy considerations that are triggered and that, frankly, need to be balanced each time the FDA does approve a new and, probably more importantly, a very expensive therapy?
Yeah, now that we know what the goal is, our discussion we're going to start out with is the cost challenges that payers are facing in their budgets, because these FDA approvals are novel new medicines, and more recently the gene therapies, and they're very innovative, and they're delivering a very high efficacy, as we have mentioned earlier, in many cases life-saving efficacy, but it's at very high cost. So these new biologics and gene therapies are targeted to rare diseases with high unmet needs, okay? Which means the high cost of researching, developing, and manufacturing these products must be recovered by the manufacturer from the utilization, which is usually in pretty small patient populations, okay? So we have a situation of high unmet needs, small patient populations, but very complex rare diseases. Now, biologics and gene therapies differ from your molecular drugs, which are often, called small molecule, in that they are manufactured from living organisms rather than chemical molecules. So as a result, because they're manufactured from living organisms such as cells, the development and manufacturing processes are very expensive and time-consuming. But before we move on, I'll just say a couple of words about what is a gene therapy, because they're very new, they're starting to hit the market, and we're reading a lot about them. So a human gene therapy seeks to modify or manipulate the expression of the gene and to alter the biological properties of the living cells for a therapeutic use. So what does all that mean? Well, it means gene therapy is a technique that modifies a person's gene to treat or cure the disease. And they work by several different ways. One, they can either replace a disease-causing gene with a healthy copy of the same gene, or they can inactivate a disease-causing gene that is not functioning properly, or finally, they can introduce a new or modified gene into the body. So, we have a hard-to-treat disease with a small patient population with a very complex treatment options being developed. That's the sort of landscape of the new products. But another reason that these new therapies are expensive, and it's a challenge to the plans, is a lack of competitive generic alternatives, okay? Because of the high cost and complexity of researching, developing, and manufacturing these, it results in a lot more cost and complexity in gaining FDA approval for generic equivalents, which in the case of biologics are called biosimilars. As a lack of result, there are a lack of these competitive products in the market to help bring down the price of the innovator products. So the resulting dilemma for the plan is we have these products that don't have generic alternatives in most cases, is how do we pay for these new therapies while maintaining other plan benefits? Because remember, this new therapy isn't the only thing the plan's trying to pay for. There's a lot of things the plan has to cover. So we'll discuss that in greater detail, though, when we move through the presentation. But finally, I wanted to mention really the main challenge that's coming along is not just the few that have been approved so far, but what's anticipated as an avalanche of new products. There was a report by the Association for the Brand Pharmaceutical Manufacturers earlier this year, and it identified there are 289 gene therapies in various stages of clinical development for over 100 diseases, and that more than half of those are in oncology. So therefore, the concern, in a recent survey by the National Business Group on Health, 86% of large employers said they were concerned or very concerned about the impact of multi-million-dollar treatments being approved by FDA. In the same article, there was a quote from Sarah Rothstein, the director of the 32BJ Health Fund, that says, "It's not the first gene therapy drug that concerns me the most. It's the 10th or the 100th or the 1000th that will concern me." And then also containing that article, it mentioned that the FDA expects to approve between 10 and 20 gene and cell therapies each year by the year 2025. So,
hey, James, can I interject again? These are great quotes, relevant quotes, but frankly, they're a bit theoretical to me. Essentially, they're just quotes, right?
Right.
Can you give us a few real-life examples for our listeners, and frankly for me, as to what all this means in real life?
Yeah, and in fact, to illustrate what we were just talking about in terms of concerns and high costs, we pulled together just a few examples of these types of high-cost drugs that have been approved recently. For instance, you have Spinraza. It was approved in December of 2016. So what's noteworthy of that is just 3 years ago, okay? And it was one of the first to come out. It was to treat spinal muscular atrophy in children, and it was approved with a price tag of $750,000 for the first year. And the unique thing about this drug is you need to keep doing the treatment each year, and it would be $375,000 for the subsequent years, okay? So it would keep growing. Yescarta was approved for the treatment of large B-cell lymphoma with, once again, a price tag of $373,000 per treatment regimen, okay? It's a cancer treatment. Luxturna, which is one that we'll talk a little bit about later in the presentation, was approved in December of 2017 with an $850,000 price tag for a one-time treatment. And then Onprado, and once again, these aren't all that are out there, but It treats neurological diseases that cause progressive disabilities, and it's $450,000 per year. Okay, so those are examples of what we were just talking about. These are coming out. No one's arguing that they aren't fantastic drugs, life-saving, life-altering drugs. For instance, if you can avoid of being blind, what's that worth? But it's just a big lump challenge to the plan because it comes at you all at once. Okay. Now, Zoll is the most recent example. Okay, it's a gene therapy, and it's a good illustration of this dilemma. In fact, we're going to talk about it more later. Although it provides what is basically a cure for a devastating disease in infants. Okay. It's a one-time injection. It has a $2.1 million price tag, and at the time, the headlines that almost every day read, most expensive drug ever approved. Okay, and as I said, no one questions there's going to be longer-term savings to the plan. Okay, if you're going to cure someone right up front with this $2.1 million patient, although it'll take some time for the cure to kick in, you'll save costs down the road in terms of hospitalizations and more complex and difficult medical treatment being needed, but the issue is you have to pay for it all up front. Okay. Now, as we said, our firm was involved in some counseling on this, so we'll get into that a little bit later. But before we get into a discussion of our advice with respect to making coverage decisions and what some possible alternatives are outside of plan coverage, let's first, as you mentioned earlier, take a brief high-level overview of the legal and regulatory framework, because that'll provide the foundation and framework for making your initial decisions when you're thinking about your CCG or your formulary. All right? Now, as probably everybody already knows, there are basically two types of payers or plans that operate. It's a little of a generalization, but two types. There's the commercial and then the non-government, okay? Commercial, which is non-government, and then the government. For the non-government, or what we're referring to as the commercial plans, the plan has a lot of latitude in making their decisions, okay? However, keep in mind that these plans do have what's referred to as P&T committees, and P&T means a Pharmacy and Therapeutics Committee, and it's responsible for determining and managing the formulary. And it includes, a group of people that includes physicians, pharmacists, administrators, other healthcare professionals. And the basic concept there is it's meant to put some balance into the decision process, to balance the medical scientific side with the financial considerations when you're looking at a drug and whether or not it should be on your formulary. Now, even though there's a lot of latitude, as we said, there are certain federal laws that speak to non-discrimination types of requirements when you're providing employee benefits. And the main one we probably mostly have heard and know about is ERISA, which stands for Employment Retirement Income Security Act of 1974, okay? It establishes minimum standards for any kind of a retirement, health, or welfare plan, okay? And it doesn't require an employer to actually offer a plan, but rather, if you do offer a plan, it establishes some minimum standards, okay? And now, as I said earlier, generally speaking, ERISA plans are free to determine which drugs to include in their formulary based on their P&T committee. Then another point I wanted to make was that they also can carve out high-cost drugs and impose reasonable conditions and restrictions on coverage for such drugs, and this can be done in order to reduce the pharmacy expenses for the plan, okay? However, the ERISA does require, as is shown in the slide, that it must be done on a non-discriminatory way. You can't discriminate based on a certain health condition or disability or a protected status. A couple of other laws I'll mention that we're kind of familiar with, most of us, is HIPAA. Mostly we're familiar with it in the patient health information privacy context, but it's a much larger act than that, and a part of that act that deals with not discriminating on the basis of health status-related factors such as medical conditions, medical history, or genetic information or disabilities, okay? So, some basic non-discriminatory types of things, but at the end of the day, the commercial plan through its PT committee has quite a bit of latitude. So we're not focusing so much on the commercial plans today, okay?
And is there any involvement of or any nexus with the Affordable Care Act in all of this, James?
Yes, Pete, there is a nexus, but it's pretty similar to ERISA and the HIPAA in that, a commercial plan must provide what's referred to in the Affordable Care Act as a minimum essential coverage. And we just don't have near the time to even start to go into that today, but just keep that in mind that you need to check the Affordable Care Act because there are some requirements about the minimum essential coverage. But once again, it doesn't require plans to include all drugs within its pharmacy coverage. And one other thing I wanted to point out, even with commercial plans, is we're talking federal law so far, but a lot of times your state insurance regulations or state insurance agencies have specific requirements for that state. Okay, and just one example that I thought I'd throw out is California insurance law requires coverage for a medication in certain off-label uses, okay? And so it's pretty specific, and we won't go into it. But it's just an example of state insurance laws, and the state insurance commission can have their own rules.
Okay, thanks for that.
Okay, so let's now go into the second category, the government payers.
And you know what, can I grab the con for a moment? And now that you've discussed those commercial plans, I want to go ahead and offer a brief refresher of Medicaid managed care plans, which, at least in my estimation, maybe not yours, James, but at least in my estimation, I think they give rise to the thorniest questions when it comes to coverage decisions for these high-cost medications. And as you just noted, to some extent, all coverage bets are off in the commercial plan space, notwithstanding ERISA, notwithstanding HIPAA, and notwithstanding the Affordable Care Act. But, it's not so when it comes to Medicaid managed care organizations. And they have to balance essentially more complex social and political issues. And that's due in part to those vulnerable populations which they're charged with supporting. So just to get everybody on the same page, I should point out that each state has its own statutes and regulations and sub-regulatory guidance designed to implement its Medicaid program. And obviously, those statutes, those regulations, and that sub-regulatory guidance also includes prescription drug benefits. And you multiply those requirements 50 times over, and the challenges that, James, you just laid out become even more pronounced, even more dramatic. So whatever the case, though, in the context of Medicaid managed care plans, Medicaid managed care organizations, the first stop in analyzing how those clinical coverage guidelines, how those formularies need to be and should be structured is looking back to the Medicaid prescription drug requirements for a particular state. And here's where I need to turn it back to you now, James, because you're the expert on this topic. So can you talk a little bit about some of those state-specific coverage requirements?
Yeah, Pete, and thanks for that overview. As Pete said, in the Medicaid area, it's much more complicated because it's a federal program but implemented at the state level. And so you have to look first to the federal requirements, but those are, been out there for quite a while, and they cover all areas of treatment, whether it's medical devices or provider treatments for medical treatments, but it also covers drug coverage. And when it comes to covering under Medicaid, the threshold or the baseline or the initial analysis for coverage under Medicaid is whether or not it's medically necessary, or medical necessity it's sometimes referred to. Now, I mentioned federal and state. Well, there is no federal definition of what medical necessity is, so each state has developed its own definition and criteria. And I can't emphasize enough, and I'll probably say it 30 times or 40 times in the next 30 minutes, that you have to go state by state, okay? Each state's very unique in this respect. But keep in mind, the states are not required to cover a medication simply because the FDA has approved it or a prescriber has prescribed it, okay? And we'll get more detail into that, but, you know, that's a basic concept because people, I think, a lot of times are confused with, well, my doctor prescribed it, why isn't it covered? And it has to do with this whole medical necessity. So since there's not a federal definition, if the standard is medical necessity, what does that mean? Okay. Well, once again, I said state by state. Okay. We've had the opportunity to look at many states, you know, in counseling our clients in various states. So, but what I've done is tried to summarize 4 areas that are pretty consistent state to state when you think about what medical necessity means. And as I said, this isn't just for drugs, it's for all kinds of treatment, but for drugs, the treatment is a confirmed diagnosis of an illness within the approved product label and not in excess of the patient's needs. Okay, so that gets back to it's in the product's label, and so one drug may be considered medically necessary, but another's not because they would say, well, that's in excess of what this patient needs. You can go ahead and prescribe it. It's just we're not going to cover it because it's not medically necessary. All right? Is it consistent with generally accepted professional medical standards, which is often referred to as the standard of care? And very importantly, it's not experimental or investigational. And that has to do with medical necessity. A lot of times drugs are used off-label. Unapproved uses are oftentimes referred to because they've not been approved by the FDA. And so the medical necessity standards in many of these states say it can't be experimental or investigative, meaning it's got to be approved by the FDA, all right? And it has to be reflective of the level of service that can be safely furnished, and very important to point out in that third bullet, for which no equally effective or less costly treatment is available. So that's where it gives the states the opportunity to say, you know, I know you want the new shiny drug just approved, but we believe there's an equally effective drug that's less costly, and we have to think about the big picture and take care of everyone, so we're only going to cover the less costly alternative, okay? And the reason they can do that is because their medical necessity standard says if there's a less costly alternative available. And then finally, furnished in a manner not primarily intended for convenience of the recipient, caretaker, or provider, okay? So they have flexibility, you know, as long as they're meeting these type of standards. And the real important ones to point out are it's got to be approved labeling, okay, for the right patient population within the research results of that, which the FDA took into consideration, and is there any other alternative therapies available, okay? So based on that, what happens is the states have kind of their equivalent of a P&T committee. They don't call them that, but each state has an organization or an agency that is tasked with coming up with what's referred to as their preferred drug list, which is just another way of saying the state formulary. And so each state develops its own, okay? And as I said, they do the medical necessity determination first, and then they decide whether or not to put the drug on the PDL, okay? So if you're developing your own clinical coverage guideline under a Medicaid plan, it's important to first look, is this drug on the state PDL, okay? And so if it is covered on the state PDL, the clinical coverage guideline and formulary needs to provide coverage for that drug in no less restrictive manner than the state PDL. That's just a requirement under the Medicaid laws and regulations. So therefore, what we find in practice really is that most plans adopt the state PDL as their PDL for that Medicaid population in that state, okay? Where the complicating factor comes in, and we'll get into that with our case study, is if the drug's not on the state PDL, okay, does that mean that you don't have to cover it? And the answer to that is, well, first look at, is it on most states publish what they call prior authorization criteria, all right? And those prior authorization, or PA, people refer to them, the criteria, lay out the requirements for approving coverage for certain drugs that aren't on the PDL, but that the state feels like ought to be covered. Okay, but they also want to be able to put certain restrictions in place. So they develop these prior authorization criteria. So when you come in with that prescription or that claim, they can say, well, under our prior authorization, you need to get prior authorization from us. Or maybe in there it says you need to try this drug first, okay? Or you need to try 2 drugs first, before you try this drug. So that's the types of things they can do outside of their formulary. So even if it's not listed, you need to check that state to make sure that it's not part of their prior authorization criteria. And the bottom line to all this is, if the state hasn't already made a determination, okay, it's not on their prior authorization criteria, it's not on their formulary with this newly approved drug, then the plan should still take a look at what the medical necessity criteria are for that state and what the prior authorization types of criteria are when they're developing their formulary coverage or their CCG.
Okay. So, James, can I tee up the next slide by asking you a question? So you've laid out some great options and a variety of considerations when the state's PDL essentially lags behind the FDA's approval schedule. But what do we do when a therapy like Zolgensma shows up on the market mid-year, and then the plan design and the formulary for that year have already been set? So kind of putting it another way, what do we do when a Medicaid managed care plan has been allocated funds, has been assigned rates to manage a member population, and then it's got to factor into the situation drugs which, in the cases like we're discussing here, typically exceed $500,000 a dose? So surely that's going to throw off the margins, especially if the individuals who are covered by a particular plan need that particular treatment. So what do we do then, James?
Well, that's a real dilemma, Pete, and that's real life. That's what happens. In fact, that was what we got involved in earlier this summer, as you well know. But there are some things we can talk about that have already been done, so there's precedence for them, that a plan can look to in dealing with the state Medicaid agency, okay? One is, as we've said, there should be a Medicaid contract in place, okay? That's what the NCO is about. With that state, and obviously, first step would be to take a look at that contract. Does it have anything in there that might address the situation you're looking at? Okay, maybe I'll make up a situation. If it's a therapy and there are no other therapies, then there may be something in the contract that says, hey, if there are no other alternatives, you have to cover this. That's just an example. Okay. So look to the Medicaid contract. But a couple of more interesting ones, and that we would talk about that there are actually precedents for, is the first one we'll talk about, which is more common, is what's called a carve-out. Okay, and in this instance, what happens is the state Medicaid plan carves out high-cost medications from the pharmacy benefit of that plan into a fee-for-service type situation. And there are some precedents for this in areas such as hemophilia, hepatitis C, mental health, and substance abuse disorder treatments. Okay, so those are ones we've already seen these carve-outs done. And the concept behind the carve-outs is the plan goes to the state, and the state realizes that absent the carve-out, the plan is going to have to increase their capitation rates, increase their premium rates to the state. The plan has to recover that increased high cost. And if the state's interested in keeping those rates at a certain level, they may look at that as a special situation and say, well, for that situation, we'll carve that out, we'll cover it under fee-for-service, so you don't have to cover it as part of your plan. And, an example of that is Maryland. The state of Maryland Medicaid has a mental health formulary of drugs where they've carved out from their requirements under their NCO plans, and they cover it on a fee-for-service basis by the state Medicaid agency, okay? And these are generally, very complex and hard to manage conditions. You look at, hemophilia, hepatitis C. I mean, they're hard to manage, and so therefore the states realize this is a huge burden on the plan. It's going to increase costs for everybody, so let's carve it out. Okay, there's a second approach that's really pretty difficult to obtain. It's pretty rare, but the states will sometimes provide, and I didn't make this up. It's a supplemental payment, but for whatever reason, it's often referred to as a kick payment. Okay, and what these are supplemental state payments the state agrees to make to the plan to cover the cost of the treatment, in lieu of the plan, once again, being forced to increase their capitation rates or premiums. Now,
so this might actually cover that situation I just described with the mid-year arrival of
either one of these.
Okay.
You could look at it as going to the state and appealing to the state of, hey, this was just approved. We know it was just approved. This is a very high cost that we don't have within our budgets, and so therefore, can we carve this out, or can you provide a supplemental payment to assist with the payment of this so that we can hold our capitation rates down? Okay, that's an example, and there is an example of that in the state of Missouri where we happen to be sitting. They have a Medicaid policy for these types of supplemental payments to plans to cover a low birth weight newborns. Okay, once again, as you said earlier, a very vulnerable population, the Medicaid population, and they realize these situations are going to arise. So we have two alternatives there we can look at. And then once again, as with the commercial plans, I won't say a lot about it, but you also need to look at the state insurance laws to see if there's anything there. Okay, so kind of in summary, we have the commercial plans, you have a lot of latitude. The Medicaid plans have latitude, but only to the degree if they can meet the medically necessary criteria, okay? But they get some help on that from the states, with the states providing their preferred drug lists, okay? So what we're going to jump into next is a case or a situation one that you kind of brought up earlier too, was what happens if this very expensive medication comes out and the state hadn't even had a chance to review it, and yet you're getting claims in from your members, okay? And you're asking yourself, what should we do? Now, this case, this Zoll case, provided some very unique circumstances, okay, which we'll talk about. But we think it's a good case to look at applying these laws and principles that we've just been discussing. All right. So to get kind of set the table here, there was a few facts. When it was approved in May of 2019, so it's extremely recent. Okay. It was not initially on a state PDL or prior authorization criteria for obvious reasons, because our client was getting claims coming in before the state had even dealt with it, okay? It was approved and labeled for treatment, and this is very important to keep in mind, type 1. There's 4 types of spinal muscular atrophy in infants, but Zolgensma was approved for type 1 in infants less than 2 years of age, all right? That being said, the clinical trials that formed the basis for FDA approval were in infants less than 6 months old, okay? So the only patient population studied was 6 months or less. It's still a little bit of a mystery to us why FDA approved it for 2 years when it wasn't studied, but they did, okay? So this, provided us with somewhat of a dilemma in the case of, one question that came up was, could the coverage guideline limit its use to infants 6 months or less, even though the FDA label was for 2 years? And that was a difficult one to go through, but we'll step through the thought process on that in a minute. Another important consideration was the label included a limitation in the label that it was not studied in patients with advanced disease. And by advanced disease, that means, these infants, it's a horrible disease. And so they don't develop muscle structure and things. A lot of them end up within a year. They're on respirators. They can't move. They require intravenous feeding. I mean, it's an awful disease, okay? But for that reason, it wasn't studied in these really, really severe cases. It was studied in patients that were progressing, but they weren't quite severe. And there was no label research done on what happens if you start out on one therapy then switch. And the manufacturer has ongoing studies as we speak that's studying it in type 2 and for ages, above 2 years of age. And the other salient fact to keep in mind was Spinraza also treats spinal muscular atrophy, and it's not limited to 2-year-olds, and it had been on the market for 2 years when Zolgensma was approved. So we have this fact is a member with type 2, remember, Zolgensma type 1. The member had type 2, but they were prescribed by their provider with Zolgensma. And the member just so happened to be 23 months of age, okay, and remember 2 years. So there was a lot of desperation going on here about, well, wait a minute, if we wait very long here, we're going to be outside the label.
Desperation on the part of the parents.
Yeah, exactly. Desperation on the part of the parents, and obviously the parents can feel that desperation. Okay, now another complicating factor. The member had severe motor impairment, muscle weakness, muscle wasting, wasn't able to stand, wasn't able to bear weight or to take steps. Was not on a respirator yet, but basically was very immobile, all right? And as we said, the state plan hadn't put it on there yet. So since it wasn't on the MCO plan's formulary or the state PDL, the member filed for a prior authorization request. Okay, what was the outcome of this case? Thinking about everything we've talked about, let's talk a little bit about kind of the process, and then we'll go through the analysis. Well, let's go through the analysis first. The salient facts to keep in place are it was the patient had type 2, not type 1, okay? The member was suffering from advanced disease. And remember we said there was a label limitation that said it wasn't studied for that. There was another treatment on the market, okay? It had been out so recently it couldn't be considered the standard of care. I mean, it was all new, okay? So, and the fact that the manufacturer was studying it in type 2 would tend to make you think it's still experimental for type 2. So what happened was the prior authorization request was denied by the plan as not medically necessary, which we, in conjunction with the plan, thought they had very solid legal footing on which to make that determination based on everything we talked about, okay? That when they developed the clinical coverage guidelines, this particular patient would not have been covered by those guidelines, okay? The member, of course, appealed the denial, and it goes first, in this case, to the plan has kind of an independent committee of medical experts that are within the plan, okay, and they upheld the denial of the appeal. Then the patient, obviously, as we said, desperate patients, parents, as we all would be, appealed it to what's called a fair hearing officer, and that's a Medicaid process that's put in place at the state level where you can appeal above the plan. And so an independent medical expert called a fair hearing officer will hear the case, looked at everything and said, we agree, we're going to uphold the denial, okay? So the final step for the parents of the member to take was the member appeal to the district court, okay? So once again, just remember, our counsel advice was that the plan was on very solid footing, legally, regulatorily, by all the rules that are in place to deny the coverage. However, in this case, the plan decided to grant authorization, and it was for reasons other than what we thought the strength of their legal position was. Hey, so it's a real-life example.
Yeah, and just a point of clarification, you talked enough about Spinraza as being an alternative out there, but in this particular case, was the patient, was the individual, was the covered member on Spinraza before the request for Zolgensma came about?
No, and that was one, the effects of the case also were that the prescribing physician, this was the second physician that had seen the patient, so you're kind of reading between the lines, but there may not have been a good solid diagnosis till they got to the second physician, and they were already advancing, obviously. and the physician, and there's tests for all this, tested and diagnosed the patient with type 2, okay? But the physician had been in the clinical trials for Zolgensma, and this is very common. So the physician said, I know there's already another treatment, but in my medical opinion, I think this treatment's better. I know it wasn't studied in type 1, but they are studying it in type 2, and there's some, we could talk about this for another 30 minutes, but there were some interim results out, and so anyway, the physician was very strong in their feeling that, yeah, it's type 2, but this patient has progressed so far, I want them on Zolgensma.
Okay.
So that wasn't a complicating factor in this case.
Well, thanks. And James, thanks for sharing that case study. You did a fantastic job bringing to light all those factors that we discussed at the beginning, and how, including the legal process, because obviously that's a consideration as well, in decisions involving, whether and how to cover a high-dollar therapy. I'd like to shift the conversation a bit now and focus for a moment on the plan member. And I mentioned I might do this at the outset of our webinar. And specifically what I'd like to do is briefly review some of the options that are available to a plan member to obtain a prescribed and a potentially life-altering treatment when that very expensive life-altering treatment has been carved out or partially carved out from the plan design. So when this occurs, essentially there are three options available to an individual to gain access to their drug. And first, the members meeting certain eligibility criteria can look to the pharmaceutical manufacturer itself and sign up for the patient or a patient assistance program to help make his or her financial ends meet. Second, as most folks are aware, there are also 501c3 charitable organizations out there that provide funding for financially qualified patients for specific disease states. And last, an increasingly more frequent phenomenon that we're seeing, members have taken steps to source their necessary medications from pharmacies outside the U.S. And then what they do once they do that is submit reimbursement requests to their plans, and in some instances, the plan's HSA will cover all or a part of the cost of that outsourced or internationally outsourced drug. So let's go ahead and take a little bit deeper dive into each of those three options, and also talk a little bit about the compliance risks that are associated with each of those. So first off, I should probably add a little bit more definition to what we mean when we say patient assistance program. And as many of you are aware, pharmaceutical manufacturers sponsor or may sponsor PAPs to provide financial assistance or free drugs, free products to financially needy individuals. And the interesting thing here is that in the context of these high-dollar drugs that we're talking about, that's just about everybody. And so once you're in that category of being financially needy, the patient or the plan member, as it may be, becomes enrolled in this patient assistance program at the point of prescription. That is typically the physician's office. And once the physician decides that a particular drug is medically necessary for a particular patient and then goes ahead and prescribes that particular medication, the patient is often asked in the moment in the office to fill out an enrollment form for the PAP associated with that particular product. And as you might expect, these types of PAPs are essentially designed to get a specific drug to a specific patient, and hence the involvement of the manufacturer, and hence the underwriting by the manufacturer of that particular PAP. So interestingly, there is a bit of confusion here as to whether this type of manufacturer help or this type of manufacturer support is acceptable in the government plan space. And at least with respect to Medicare beneficiaries, CMS has indicated that PAPs can provide certain types of assistance to Part D enrollees, and they can interface with Part D plans by operating outside the Part D benefit, and I used air quotes there for you listening. In that, outside the Part D benefit really ensures a separation of the Part D benefit from the PAP support itself. Now, all that said, the government will draw a line, and draw a compliance line for that matter, and potentially trigger a enforcement action when the intent of that manufacturer's PAP, at least from the perspective of the government, is designed simply to encourage the use of a particular product that can then be billed to a federal health care program. And over the last 2 years, as I'm sure, again, everybody's aware, there has been a spate of DOJ, OIG settlement action or settlements with pharmaceutical companies, pharmaceutical manufacturers, and that underscores this particular point. So that's the manufacturer PAP. Let's talk a little bit about charitable disease funds. In contrast to the product-specific bent of a manufacturer's patient assistance program, the charitable disease funds are typically, as I mentioned already, 501c3 tax-exempt organizations which tend to be agnostic when it comes to the therapies or drugs themselves that are prescribed to treat an individual's condition. The focus of the Charitable Disease Fund is really to identify the eligible patient and then support them. And then that support typically takes the form of financial, making financial resources available to that individual. And that's very much consistent with the charitable mission of the 501c3 entity. So that said, just because you're a charity doesn't mean you can't get caught in the government's crosshairs. And specifically, again, everybody's been reading the headlines, there have been a growing number of DOJ settlements which call into question the practice of pharmaceutical companies donating to charitable disease funds, and those charitable disease funds in turn offering financial help with out-of-pocket drugs or out-of-pocket costs for drugs for patients. And interestingly and notably, within the last 2 months, the DOJ announced a couple of multi-million-dollar settlements with charities alleging that they operated as pass-through organizations for pharmaceutical manufacturers. And essentially the intent that the government was alleging was that those manufacturers were seeking to induce the Medicare patients to use their high-dollar, high-cost medications by providing this funding through the Charitable Disease Fund. Now, the strength of the government's case in these settlements often hinges on whether the donations from the manufacturer to the charity are truly independent. That is, there's no expectation, there's no quid pro quo that the donation is going to be directed to a particular individual who's been prescribed that company's product. So if the charity understands that it's getting X dollars from X manufacturer and it is supposed to take those dollars and direct them to a patient who has been prescribed the manufacturer's product, that will be problematic from the government's perspective. And when that occurs, the government typically argues that the anti-kickback statute has been violated. And, the kind of overriding premise here is that the supposedly charitable disease fund is being used simply as a conduit to funnel impermissible financial support from the manufacturer to the beneficiary. So in light of, do you have a
could I just say a couple of points, Pete? In my experience when I was working in-house at the pharmaceutical company, the reason these charitable disease funds came about was what you had mentioned earlier. As a pharmaceutical manufacturer, we would have, say, a government payer patient come to us and say, we're needy, we need financial assistance. And we would say, we can't do that. There are federal anti-kickback laws that prevent us. And so patients worked through Congress and others who tapped the OIG and the Department of Justice on the shoulder and said, we need to fix this. So they came up with this idea, and I think very good idea in the sense of a truly independent, charitable organization to take donations and then provide money to patients for any kind of therapy they're taking. That's the concept. And like you say, the way you can get your toe stubbed is if the manufacturer says, here's some money, but only give it to my patients. That's an extreme example, obviously. But one other factor is, I don't know, but I would assume when Zolgensma was approved, there wasn't a disease fund for spinal muscular atrophy because there was only one other therapy.
Right.
And one of the things that can get you in real trouble is to start a fund where there's only one therapy,
yeah.
and the only donor is that manufacturer.
Yeah, and to underscore your point, we've set up quite a few charitable disease funds, and in the organizational documents, and specifically in the 501c3 application, we're making sure that particular entity casts their net wide when it comes to the disease state and appropriate therapies. Because the inclination for a lot of these organizations is really kind of focus narrowly, and we try to get them to broaden their perspective so as not to get into these kickback situations. So thanks for that.
Sure.
All right, a couple minutes left here. I need to turn quickly to this third access alternative that seems to be increasingly popular, at least to us it seems to be increasingly popular because we've been asked to help out on these projects, a number of these projects recently. And that option involves the international sourcing of high-cost drugs. And as again, you may be aware, the FDA does allow, or at least it turns a blind eye, to drug importation by individuals for personal use on a limited basis. And basically what that means is that an individual can bring about a 90-day supply of a drug into the country at any given time, and that's personal use. The FDA does get a bit prickly, however, when the activity becomes abusive, not in the physical sense, but kind of in the regulatory sense. And specifically what I mean there is that the FDA's enforcement antenna go up when there appears to be a scheme, again using air quotes, to facilitate the importation of a drug, and particularly an unapproved drug. And that scheme threshold arguably is tripped when the importation becomes baked into the plan design and exceeds that personal use exception that I just mentioned. That said, the regulatory risk of international sourcing appears to be pretty low given the limited number of enforcement actions that we've seen related to the procurement of drugs internationally by individuals and entities here in the United States. And case in point, earlier this year, the FDA issued a warning letter to a company that requested it cease brokering distribution of prescription drugs by international pharmacies to enrollees in about 500 health plans across the country, including those offered by cities, counties, school districts, other municipalities. And interestingly, the FDA really hasn't taken that matter any further. And, in terms of popular revolt, the other interesting thing to mention is many of those impacted cities, counties, school districts, municipalities have actually publicly chastised the FDA for taking that position with respect to that particular company. And they continue to use that company's services, so touche FDA. And moreover, one of the further examples of the low risk associated with this particular option is that back in July of this year, HHS and the FDA did announce that they were working together to come up with an action plan to facilitate the safe importation of drugs from Canada. We've got about 2 slides left and a minute for our presentation. But before I turn things over to you for final thoughts, James, I want to mention that all these 3 trends that I just mentioned in terms of facilitating access, we've seen employer-sponsored health plans carve out these high-dollar medications and turn over their management of the disease state and the associated pharmacy costs to third parties. And those third parties, in turn, employ these 3 strategies that I just tossed out there. So back to you, James, in the limited time.
Limited time, yes. Well, I will quickly go through a few final thoughts, and these are final thoughts related to, okay, you're in a situation, you've already made this determination, it's going to be on formulary, and you are going to cover it. So what are some things you can do to mitigate that high cost? And we've already talked about the carve-outs or kick payments, so I'll move on to the value-based contracting. Okay, and in this scenario, the plan would contract with the manufacturer to, if the outcomes expected from the drug are not achieved, then the manufacturer rebates back to the plan some or all of the cost of that drug. So the manufacturer's taking on risk that the drug's going to actually work, and if it works, it will save you, over time. And it's been used with Luxturna, one of the drugs we talked about. Now, one of the issues when you get into value-based contracting is members move around, okay? So if the outcome isn't known for a year or two and the members change plans, it creates some complication about where the rebate goes back to and who gets the rebate and who's, But anyway, that's just a complicating factor. But it's one thing to consider that you can do these value-based or outcome-based contracts. There's also this concept of an amortized payment plan, and when Zolgensma was approved, the manufacturer said they would work with payers to allow for a payment over a 4-year period. Once again, it's to mitigate that hit of having to pay for it all at once. And then finally, there's options that are starting to come out for insurance that covers these high-cost gene therapies. Sometimes as low as $1 a month, and the goal is to provide the payer predictability on covering these new expensive therapies.
Okay. All right. We're a minute over. Let's wrap things up.
Yeah.
From my perspective, the most value-added component of today's webinar was James's case study on the Zolgensma dilemma. We use air quotes on that, too. Probably going to become an industry term of art now. But anyways, the factors that we need to take into consideration in responding to one of those dilemmas are listed here. And we're 2 minutes over now, folks. That's it for today's program. I just want to close things out administratively. And thank you all once again for joining us today. We hope that the information that we provided was helpful to you, to your organization. And if you haven't done so already, please click on the survey icon at the bottom of your screen to complete our short survey. Your feedback assists us in providing high quality and relevant future programs. And then as a reminder, as I said at the beginning, the program has been approved for Illinois, Iowa, Missouri, Nebraska, Tennessee, and Texas CLE, and the Colorado and Wisconsin credit is still pending. And again, as I mentioned earlier, a recording of the webcast will be available tomorrow for watching and sharing, and once available, a link to the recording will be emailed to you along with a certificate of attendance. This concludes our webinar. Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays.